Welcome on in, football fans. It's your boy, Gsluke, here with our Monday Night Football preview for tonight's matchup between the Ravens and the Chargers. Gonna make sure you're ready for all of your DFS and prop exposure, but first off, a look at the Draftkings Showdown side and how I'm handling the single game slate. Then afterwards, more of a prop breakdown where we're gonna look at the Underdog and Prize Picks boards and give you one 10.5x slip that I've already entered myself to give you an idea of how I'm attacking that side of things. So by the end, gonna have all the info you need to go out there and make this Monday a good one for your exposure and hopefully one into the green on both sides. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop right on in. But first off, look at the Draftkings DFS slate. We've got a potential shootout in store tonight with over a 50-point total between these two teams, and with two defenses that rank top 7 at defending opposing running backs. There could be quite a bit of passing involved as well. So whether it's the offenses for either team, the quarterbacks, or some of those pass catching options, that's where your chalk is going to come in. And because the spread is about 3 points out there in most books, you're not going to see one team or the other really getting all that much more attention. So whether it's the Ravens or the Chargers, it's a pretty even split between the two teams. If there's one aspect where you might be able to find some leverage, it would be with the running game from either team. So a Derrick Henry a little bit lower owned than he probably should be. I've got J.K. Dobbins at sub 30% combined ownership, which compared to the 67% of a Herbert, a 75% ownership number up there in Lamar Jackson. You can see with some of the pass catching options, they're in that like 30 to 45% range. There's definitely an emphasis on the passing attack for either side. So if you're playing in the large field GPP, the one thing to avoid if you don't want to be super chalky would be a 3-3 with a quarterback out there from both teams and then 1 to 2 pass catchers mixed in as well. I think that that's going to be where a majority of the field is playing, and while that's probably the most likely to hit outcome, if you're entering the 50 to 100,000 entry contest, you're going to have a hard time not duplicating yourself if you go with that kind of build. So if you're entering trying to win first place in that kind of contest, you might want to take a stance against what the rest of the field is doing, whether that would be playing Derrick Henry over there for the Ravens, going with more of a rushing heavy approach, perhaps with both running backs. That would be the way to go out there and get different tonight. So in terms of your injury report, usually like to start with the chalk and then injuries before we start to go player by player. The one major injury on the offensive side is going to be Lad McConkey for the Chargers. So he is technically questionable right now, but I do have him projected as playing out there tonight. So if that changes, we'll have to account for it out there in our projections. The main impact would come to the second and third string wide receivers out there for the Chargers. So Quinn Johnston, Joshua Palmer would see a significant uptick in usage as well as projection. And then if you go down towards the bottom end of the board, you could even say that guys like a Jalen Reagor are probably going to have a little bit higher floor if you have him rolled out there. So as of right now, I am not expecting that to be the case, but I always like to talk about the potential implications of a player missing it, as obviously we don't know beforehand. So let's go player by player, give you guys an idea of how I'm actually going to attack each player, how I'm going to use them in game scripts, whether I think that there's opportunity for leverage and how to use them, and give you guys an idea, a little taste for my exposure tonight. So towards the top end of the board, Lamar Jackson is by far the most popular player, even at $11,000, and I can't argue against it. His floor is essentially 15 to 16 points, and his ceiling is up there in that 30 to 35 point range. So he's by far the best play on the slate. You're going to see that reflected by the rest of the field. I think Lamar Jackson's the sort of player that you play when you can tonight and you differentiate elsewhere. So I wouldn't get too cute about it. If you're going to go out there and fade Lamar Jackson, there's one reason to do so. That would be that Derrick Henry's going out there and stealing all of the usage, because if Derrick Henry's not scoring 2-3 touchdowns, Lamar Jackson's probably at least posting one. He's probably getting you 40, 50 rushing yards. I don't know, like 200 passing yards. You can see where that floor is coming in out there with Lamar. However, there are very specific scenarios where maybe Derrick Henry is the one guy that you need up top. So Lamar Jackson will be by far my highest exposed play tonight, but at the same time, if you fade him, well, it does put you on some rather interesting game scripts. Speaking of, Derrick Henry down here, just 47% combined ownership, is lower owned than I think he should be. And while I do agree that the passing attack for either side is probably where we're going to see a lot of the production coming in, Derrick Henry is capable of going off regardless of the defense that he's playing. So the Chargers, by the way, are the number 2 team in the league at defending opposing running backs. So very elite in that sort of category. But Derrick Henry has shown us in the past that he's just built different. I mean, he's got that combination of speed and power to go out there and take any run for 70, 80 yards. If he does that once, twice, like Saquon Barkley did out there last night, it could be an absolute massive game for Derrick Henry. So I like the ownership number. I actually think he's lower owned than he probably should be. So if I was playing in large field GPPs, that 50, 100,000 entry sort of contest, Derrick Henry is almost certainly going to be my captain. So I think a lot of my exposure is going to be more single entries, smaller field stuff, as I tend to agree that those passing defenses are very susceptible tonight. But Derrick Henry, I think for that leverage, J.K. Dobbins, you can throw into it as well. They're the clear ways to differentiate towards the top end of the board. Just like Lamar Jackson, I think Justin Herbert is a plug and play wherever you can. You can see in terms of his points per dollar value, he's second only to Lamar Jackson. So over 20.2 projected points at just $10,400 is going to be really hard to pass up. And given that the Ravens are number 31 out of 32 teams in the NFL at defending opposing quarterbacks, it is a perfect matchup out there for Justin Herbert. He had a similar situation last time around. Obviously went out there and absolutely lit it up out there in prime time, and now has arguably an even better situation to go out there and have a ceiling day. So at $10,400, you're definitely playing the price tag out there for Herbert. He's usually closer to like maybe $10,000 at the very most, but because we do have some guys that you can save salary on the slate, it's not the end of the world. So the main issue with a Herbert, just like it was with Lamar Jackson, is the fact that he's coming in at that higher ownership. But if you're using a Justin Herbert up here towards the top, you could differentiate at one of the other 3-4 spots of your lineup. So it's not the end of the world to go out there and take somebody that is 65 to 75% ownership like you have with these quarterbacks. Just you have to offset it at some other spot. You already talked about Dobbins, so let's go down here to Zay Flowers. Zay Flowers is $9,600, and though having Deontay Johnson, all these other targets out there for Baltimore often makes it really tough to get the right player at wide receiver, he does have the most upside by far. He has shown us that he's capable of that 20-25 point ceiling. So at captain, I think he makes sense in a few lineups tonight, particularly if you're looking to get a little bit different. So you've got Dobbins at only 4.3% at captain, same thing with Derrick Henry, but Zay Flowers is only 7.9% himself. So part of that comes down to the price tag. People would rather have those quarterbacks at captain if they can. And out there in large field GPPs, what I'll say is if you've taken a look at the long-term hit rates in terms of captain plays, these skill position wide players have a slightly lower hit rate than these quarterbacks, but the fact that Lamar is like 25% owned, I mean, Herbert's nearly 15% owned, these quarterbacks are normally way overutilized when it comes to their hit rate at captain. So that's usually why I'm looking at guys like a Zay Flowers, a Derrick Henry, a J.K. Dobbins at that position, as usually there's a lot of leverage to be had. And at about 8% at captain, if you're putting him in 15% of your lineups at that spot, I think there's upside to be had there. Ladd McConkey, if he plays, is going to be a key portion of my player pool. Of course, guys, for all these projections as they update throughout the day to make sure that you can see the impact of McConkey potentially being rolled out. You can see my entire player pool, all the script notes, all the player notes I have over here, including whether they're in my core right out there for tonight. Make sure to check out the Patreon page for that. But I'm giving you guys a little bit of an insight into that. If Ladd McConkey is going to be active, he's going to be one of my higher exposed plays in this range. He's a PPR monster. The Baltimore Ravens are favored tonight, which means I'm expecting the Chargers to have to pass the ball quite a bit. And if that's going to be the case, McConkey is usually the main beneficiary of that, as in those passing heavy games, he's gone for 7-8 catches almost every single time, which on a PPR website like Draftkings, where you're getting 7-8 points right there just for the catches, there's yardage adds on top of that, any potential touchdown would be a gold mine, cherry on the top of that. $9,000 I think is extremely fair. So he's coming with some ownership, just like most of these pass catching options. They're getting some steam just because of the matchup tonight, but I don't necessarily disagree with that. So I would say of these wide receivers, my favorite would be Ladd, just because he has more PPR upside than Quinn Johnston, who's a little bit more of a downfield wide receiver. Same thing with Zay Flowers. He's a little bit more of that boom bust sort of play, whereas McConkey, I love as a buyback, even in like 4-2 Ravens lineups, because he brings most of his production out there from the PPR aspect, which is massive on a site like Draftkings. Moving down a little bit further, we've got Quinn Johnston and Will Dissly. Love the price tag out there on Dissly, but he doesn't have the highest ceiling. I mean, truly probably about a 20-point ceiling out there on Dissly. So he's more of a flex play, maybe not my favorite captain play out there for tonight, but at a 10.8 point projection is far from the worst guy down here in the mid tier. Also like some Rashad Bateman, even with Deontay Johnson being added to the team, Bateman has still been that number 2 wide receiver. So until that changes, I am not changing my projections. Bateman is that number 2 projected wide receiver on the Ravens. And given that this is a really good matchup tonight, I don't understand why he's only 20% owned. So as of right now, I think he's going to be one of my more leveraged plays down here in the 5K range, as his ceiling is 20 plus points. I mean, I know he's down here at 9 points, doesn't have the highest floor, which you can kind of say the same thing with Flowers, right? He doesn't have the highest floor. He's more of a boom bust sort of player. That's why I said it's tough to get the right wide receiver out there for Baltimore. But what you've seen this year, whether it's likely Andrews having a big game, one of these top 2 wide receivers is usually one of them is going for like 20 plus points. So if I'm looking for a captain tonight, I think those running backs make sense if you want to get a little bit different. But if you're going to play a slightly higher owned captain, I think both of those top wide receivers make sense for either team. The 2 tight ends for Baltimore make sense, as we'll talk about here in just a minute. But potentially even like a Bateman at 2.3%. Josh Palmer, he's a solid mid-tier player, but if McConkey's rolled out, he'd probably be the best value player on the slate. So at $5,200, he's only about 1.6 points per dollar value right now. But if he ends up being that number 1 or 2 wide receiver, the reason why I like him even more so than a Johnston if McConkey's rolled out is Palmer's more of a PPR wide receiver. He's more of a route runner. Quinn Johnston's the kind of like home run play threat that you have out there in the team. Palmer's probably going to see more targets if you have McConkey rolled out. So somebody you're going to want to keep an eye on out there before lock. But even if that doesn't happen, I still think he's in play out there for GPPs at slightly lower ownership. Both of these kickers make a lot of sense given the high total. They both also project off the board because of that as well. 8.8 points for Dicker. You get 8.7 out there for Justin Tucker. So kickers are never my favorite plays out there for any given slate, but they're usually ones that I try and match the field on. So that's what I'm expecting that I'm going to be doing out there for tonight, especially in this high total kind of affair. Next up, we got these 2 tight ends for Baltimore, which I'm going to go ahead and actually group these 2 together. It's really hard to guess which one's going to go off. So just like those wide receivers, it's tough to guess which one's going to be the alpha any given week. But Mark Andrews, Isaiah Likely have a really good matchup tonight. The linebackers of the Chargers have not had the best chance at going down and slowing down opposing attacks. So Andrews, Likely, both have plenty of upside after the catch. I would say Isaiah Likely maybe has a slightly higher ceiling than Mark Andrews, but Mark Andrews has the higher floor compared to Isaiah Likely. So if I'm playing in a single entry cash lineup, that sort of thing, I'm probably siding towards a Mark Andrews, but I think both have upside out there in the large field GPPs. It's just that Likely maybe has a better chance of being the optimal captain. So I love Likely at captain. I'll probably still have some Mark Andrews at the captain position, but only 2% ownership on Likely, who, we've seen go for like 25, 30 fantasy points this year, is I think a little bit of a mistake. And it's not even just this year. In the past, when Mark Andrews has been injured, we've seen him go off for similarly big games. Now, both will be active tonight, which kind of eats into either one's exposure, but the upside is still there. These defenses aren't my favorite plays, just kind of like the kickers. I'm usually matching the field at most out there on these sort of options, but with the 50-point total, I will be fading both of these defenses. If they get there with a return touchdown or a pick 6, so be it, right? I mean, that's the tilting part about Showdown sometimes, but even the worst plays sometimes get there. So you're just going to kind of got to accept that at some point. Justice Hill down here at $3,200. If I'm going to go with a 4-2 Charger stack, which by the way would be relatively low owned out there in contest, a Justice Hill is going to probably be my favorite buyback option. The reason for that being that Justice Hill is more of a receiving running back. When the Baltimore is playing from behind or in the 2-minute drill out there in the first or second half, you see Justice Hill as the main running back. So here at $3,200, he's not a sexy play by any means. He's not projecting through the board at 2.2x points per dollar, but in the right right kind of scenario, he could go for 15 to 20 fantasy points. So if I'm looking for a buyback, especially a cheap buyback over there for Baltimore, I'm going to be looking at Justice Hill quite a bit. And I think the one thing to consider would be to pair him up out there with Lamar Jackson. So maybe you've got 4 Chargers out there in a lineup. You use Lamar as your one buyback and then mix in a Justice Hill. Lamar can get a lot of that done with his rushing upside. He's got a really high rushing yard line tonight, which I think is very indicative of what we may see. And then obviously with the passing upside that Justice Hill brings to the table, I don't think a lot of people are going to consider that as a 2-man buyback. And I think it makes plenty of sense because Justice Hill, by the way, if you've taken a look at his production, like 80 to 90% of it comes out of the backfield as a wide receiver. So though he's a running back, I think you almost want to treat him as another wide receiver out there, as his role is vastly different than what you have out there with Derrick Henry. Deontay Johnson, he would be an X factor out there for tonight. I'm not expecting him to be like a massive factor. I mean, he hasn't been ever since joining the Ravens. You've had Bateman in front of him. You've had those 2 tight ends playing a lot more snaps than what you have there with Deontay. At some point, I would expect him to get more involved. I mean, they traded for him for a reason, but at $3,000, he's not owned tonight. So I guess if you're looking for a pure flyer, you could use it out there in GPPs. But unless I'm playing in the large field contest and I'm trying to get really different to the field, cash, single entry, smaller field GPPs, you're probably doing too much. You're probably getting a little bit too cute if you're playing a Deontay Johnson. Speaking of, same thing out here with Gus Edwards. He's more of a large field GPP flyer. He's going to need to vulture a touchdown to get there, maybe have an injury to J.K. Dobbins to go out there and get there himself. So in the large field GPPs, where you have to find a few spots to really differentiate to the rest of the field, obviously 5.6% ownership on Deontay gets that done, but even that 12% over there in Edwards is going to be a piece of leverage towards the bottom. So I don't love any of these pure punts down here. I mean, an Aguilar, I guess, is in play as like the 4th or 5th wide receiver for Baltimore. Keaton Mitchell, probably not my favorite. He's the 3rd running back out there for Baltimore. He only gets there. There's a massive blowout in either direction. Maybe he sees some snaps if that were to happen. Tylan Wallace has gone there like once in his career. That was against the Bengals because he had an 80-yard touchdown. So like, that's the kind of play that you need from these guys. Like maybe Keaton Mitchell gets 1-2 carries tonight. Maybe one of the 2 carries goes for 60 yards. Like we never know. And Nelson Aguilar, he might get 1-2 targets out there for tonight. Maybe one of those 2 targets is a 50-yard touchdown. Like you can't roll any of these guys out like a Darius Davis. Kohler, he's the 3rd string tight end out there for Baltimore. He's more so a play when you have Andrews are likely out. Obviously, both are playing tonight, so maybe not my favorite player. Hassan Haskins, he's the 3rd string running back out there for the Chargers. Like all these guys down here, I would say with the exception of one player who we'll talk about here in a second, don't have a whole bunch of upside to go out there and get there. So a Stone Smart, 2nd, 3rd string tight end, just not going to see a bunch of snaps. Same thing with Tucker Fisk. The one guy I kind of like down here, and it's only kind of, and it's partially dependent on some injury news, is Jalen Reagor, and there's a reason for it. First off, Jalen Reagor is the kind of player that only gets a few targets a game, but they're almost always like 50, 60 yards downfield. I mean, he's just a burner. It's his one real skill set out here in the NFL is that he's faster than pretty much everyone else. He's only $800. You can see his projections there at 2.8 points, but his floor is 0 points. I mean, he's going to have more games with 0 points than games where he has points. It's just that when he goes out there, he converts on one of those long receptions, it could turn into a touchdown. And against Baltimore, who, I mean, made Jamar Chase look like an absolute god, but against a lot of other offenses has also been susceptible to the deep ball, mainly Jalen Reagor can get there. And if Ladd McConkey for some reason would be rolled out there for tonight, Reagor's going to see a lot more snaps than what we're expecting. So he's definitely got a low floor. He's more of a GPP play because of that, but because all of his targets tend to turn into big plays when he converts, I love that at $800. And if McConkey's rolled out, I don't think a lot of people are going to play a Reagor. Like, he's going to go from probably 9% combined ownership to closer to like 10 to 15%. He'd still be somebody I'm getting well over the field on. So as is, I still think he has upside in that small sample of snaps that he's likely going to play. And you've seen it this year a few times, right? It's not even like it's outside the realm of possibility that he goes out there and gets there. He's had some really decent games here in 2024. So 2.8 points, really good matchup against a secondary that's gotten burned before. He's the kind of flyer that I'm looking at towards the very bottom. And now for the prop side of things, where you've got a slip I've already entered for 10.5x. You might really consider entering yourself. So first prop we're going to go through here is going to be on the underdog side. It's going to be this over on Lamar Jackson rushing attempts. And really these first two props kind of go hand in hand. The LA Chargers have one of the best front sevens in all of football. In fact, they're number 2 in the league at defending opposing running backs in terms of fantasy points allowed per game. And Derrick Henry, he's already juiced for the under at 18.5. So you can see over here, we have a 1.07x multiplier if we take that under, which is a clear mistake. So early in the week, Derrick Henry was juiced towards the over, but on sites like Draftkings now, he's like minus 130 for the under. On FanDuel, he's at 17.5 rushing attempts. So the fact that we can take the under with juice in our favor and a 1 discrepancy compared to the other major book out there, I'll take it all day with that 1.07x multiplier. And really the reasoning for that is it's a tough front seven. I don't think they're going to be able to run the ball a whole ton. And this year, he's only gone over that kind of line in 5 games. And those have been some of the blowouts that they've had here in 2024. So with the close script, I just don't see that being the case. And especially with that kind of matchup, I think that they're going to look to other ways to generate offense than just slamming him down the middle for 1-2 yards a carry. On the other side of things, you got this Lamar Jackson over, and he's minus 135 for his over on DraftKings. And on FanDuel, last check, I think it was minus 120, minus 125 for the over, something in that range in terms of the plus EV value. So a little bit out there on the major books. But if we're going to take the under on Derrick Henry, that likely means that the Ravens are passing a little bit more. And a lot of people would think that them passing more might take away rushing attempts for Lamar Jackson. But if you've seen him play the last few years, a majority of his rushes come on passing plays where he's getting out of the pocket, he's going out there, creating when there's not a lot open with the pass. And the Chargers secondary is really good. They're really good in man-to-man coverage as well. But man-to-man coverage leaves you wide open to going out there and being run on. So Lamar Jackson, I think, is going to create some of that rushing upside for the Ravens. And I think Derrick Henry, I still think he's in play for fantasy. He still had some big games. But from the 50-50 perspective, LA Chargers are really hard to run the ball against. So, if we're going to play out here in these 50-50 props, try and go after some correlation, I don't hate the correlation between these top two. And then the last two kind of have some correlation going as well. The over on Justin Herbert, I actually got at 258.5 yards. So it is 5 yards higher now, which is obviously not ideal. So if you want to play it on Prize Picks, you can. He's over here at 260.5 passing yards. So it is 3 lower. But the payout, if you go with the same kind of props, and they have the Derrick Henry prop at 18, so I put the under on yards instead of carries over there. It's only a 9x payout, so that's why I am pointing it out over here on Underdog. But if you guys want all the props as I'm actually getting to them, make sure to join the Patreon page. Just like you guys can get all the behind-the-scenes content over there for DFS, that spreadsheet with my player pool, script notes, all of that. All of the prop slips that I'm taking can also be found on the Patreon page, so make sure to check that out if you guys want to get all the lines as soon as they drop. I still don't hate this over on Justin Herbert. As I saw this bumped, I was potentially looking at like this over on passing attempts. I don't think it was juiced towards the over, but if they're going to pass quite a bit, I don't think that's the worst lean. And let me see if that impacts the payout. So yeah, it does. Unfortunately, if you do that, it does impact the payout quite a bit, which is why I initially went with this passing yard prop. So, I think the 5-yard bump matters, but it's not the end of the world when it comes to that kind of prop. Unlike like a 45-yard rushing yard line, it's a much smaller percentage difference when it's being done on a passing yard prop that's at over 250 yards. So it's not the worst play, but it is a little bit worse now than what we got before. So we have the over on passing yards for Herbert. By the way, he was at 263.5 on most books, which is why at 258.5, I was so happy to take his over. The matchup makes plenty of sense as well. If you weren't here for the fantasy section, Ravens are number 31 out of 32 teams in the NFL at defending opposing quarterbacks. Justin Herbert showed you last week what he's capable of going out there when he has to pass a lot. And at 263.5 yards, I think it makes a lot of sense to go out there and take that over. So the under I took was over here on J.K. Dobbins. He's actually at this number on DraftKings, but he's minus 130 towards the under. On sites like FanDuel, I believe he was at like 45.5 yards. A few other sites, he was down at even 44.5 rushing yards, which considering the Ravens, by the way, are number 7 at defending opposing running backs in the NFL. LA is number 2. Ravens are number 7, hence why I think there's going to be so many passing plays. That's why I like this under on J.K. Dobbins. He is splitting snaps with Edwards from time to time. He's even got Hassan Haskins, who's gotten a few carries for the last few weeks. And considering that they're slight underdogs against the Ravens, maybe they run the ball a little bit less because of that. But I think the matchup is the bigger issue when it comes to taking this under. So I took the under there. The over on passing yards for Herbert, obviously some correlation between those two. And then we already talked about the correlation on the other side of the game. So there's not really correlation from team to team here, as you know, it's a close spread. It's a 50-point total. I don't think we want to go overboard over there. But within each team, within each offense, if things go our direction, it's going to help out both props at the same time. So the fact that we can get over a 10x payout for this 4-leg slip is pretty sweet. You get a slight correlation ding. As you can see, this 1.07x payout would normally be higher than this 10.5x payout, but it is hardly adjusted compared to where it would normally come in. So that's why I like this kind of slip. As mentioned, you can go with some of them over there on Prize Picks. The main difference being that you're going to get, it looks like they bumped up Justin Herbert, so you're not going to get a lower number anymore. Over there on that side, you're going to get a different prop on Derrick Henry, though, and a lower payout. So at this point, now that they've bumped Justin Herbert, there's really no incentive to going over there and playing this on Prize Picks. If there's a place to do it, you do it over here in Underdog for the higher payout and all of that sort of stuff. So make sure to check out the Patreon page for all the slips that I'm entering. These are just the first 4 props I went out there and entered. If there's any other value that I see before lock, you guys know that I'll be getting to it. So make sure to follow the Patreon page for all of that as I enter it, and best of luck with all of your exposure. That's all I've got out there for the Monday Night Football preview. Before I hop on out of here, go ahead, smash that like button for me, and also comment down below who you've got as the top Draftkings scorer out there for tonight's slate. If you can give me the player and their projection within 2 points, you will win a free month access of my Patreon page. That'll be including the DFS and the prop stuff over there on the NFL side. So best of luck with all of your exposure, whether it's in GPPs or over there on the prop side of things, and best of luck out there with the giveaway as well. Hopefully we can make Monday Night Football one to remember, one into the green out there for our exposure, and get after it out there for the rest of the season as well. So if you want to see all the content I'm posting, including the same breakdown that we have here for Thursday Night Football, next main slate, all the content throughout the season, subscribe so you don't miss any of that content when it drops. And let's go out there and take advantage of this Monday Night Football slate.